9,000 years ago, roughly 7,000 BCE, in a dense mud brick settlement in what is now Turkey, something is killing people. Not slowly, not one at a time. It moves through the village like a current. Here yesterday, somewhere else today. And nobody can see it, or name it, or explain why it takes some and leaves others. The healer has no answer. The elder has no answer. The dead are piling up, and the living are watching and waiting for their turn. But something else is happening too. The sick are not being abandoned. Someone is climbing to the rooftops and descending into the dark homes below, bringing food, bringing water, staying close to people that every instinct says to run from. The grain stores are still being managed, still being shared, even as the community buries its dead. And slowly, impossibly, the village holds. The dying slows, then stops. The structures that were maintained through the worst of it are still standing. The grain stores that kept distributing through the deaths are still full enough to feed the living. The people who survived go back to work. They bury their dead beneath the floors of their homes, not fleeing from them, but keeping them close. And then they keep going. Life continues, not despite what happened, through it. For centuries, we assumed ancient plague meant ancient collapse. The weak died, the strong scattered. Civilization cracked under the weight of something it couldn't see or name. That assumption is wrong, and the proof has been sitting in the ground for thousands of years. Across the ancient world, across thousands of years, across cultures that never spoke to each other or shared a written language or coordinated in any way we can identify, the same evidence surfaces, the same pattern. Villages that faced epidemic death and held together instead of fracturing. Communities that lost people but never lost themselves. What they did to survive wasn't medicine. It wasn't luck. It was something quieter and stranger. Practices so embedded in daily life, they barely look like survival techniques at all. What those practices were, why they worked, and what they cost the people who kept them. That's what this is about. Start with the person going down. Not a healer, not a shaman, just a person. Standing at the roof opening of a mud brick home, looking down into the dark at someone who cannot climb up to meet them. The sick person has been down there for weeks. The smell is bad. The sounds are worse. Outside on the rooftops, the rest of the village is going about the business of survival, grinding grain, tending fires, doing the 1,000 things that have to happen every single day just to keep people fed and alive. Nobody is making this person descend. There is no law, no authority, no one watching to make sure they go down, just the opening in the roof, the ladder, and the choice. They go down. They bring water first. They bring food, small amounts, softened, easy to swallow. They bring something else too. In their hands, wrapped in rough cloth or carried in a small clay vessel, is a preparation that has been made the same way, at the same hearth, every morning for as long as anyone in this settlement can remember. The smell of it fills the room when it is opened. Sharp, green, something between medicine and memory. Yarrow, ground and steeped and brought down into the dark every day for the person who cannot climb up to the light. This is not a coincidence, and it is not magic. Yarrow, Achillea milfolium, has been found at human sites going back 60,000 years. 60,000. Long before this settlement, long before agriculture, long before any settled community of any kind, our ancestors were already using this plant deliberately. It was carried to Neanderthal burials in what is now Iraq. Found in the hardened dental plaque of individuals who lived and died 50,000 years before the first mud brick was ever laid. The knowledge of what yarrow does to a feverish body was not discovered in the Neolithic. It was inherited, passed forward through an unbroken chain of observations so deep it predates our own species as we currently understand it. What does it do? It reduces fever. The body overheating is the body dying from its own immune response. Yarrow helps bring that temperature down, which is not a comfort measure. It is the difference between a fever that breaks and a fever that kills. It promotes sweating, which cools. It is anti-inflammatory, mildly antimicrobial. It does not cure what is killing the sick person in this dark room, but it makes the body's own fight slightly more possible. And in a world where the only thing standing between survival and death is the body's capacity to endure, slightly more possible is everything. Alongside the yarrow, on different mornings, or the same one depending on what the illness is presenting, ephedra. The dried stems, steeped or chewed directly. The effect comes quickly, airways open, breathing deepens. For a person whose chest has been tightening over days of respiratory illness, that first full breath after ephedra is the first full breath in a long time. The active compound, ephedrine, is still used in modern medicine for exactly this reason. The ancient world did not know the chemistry, it knew the effect. It had known the effect for so long that the knowledge had become indistinguishable from instinct. Then the clay. Before the herbs, before the water, possibly before anything else, the clay. Specific clays, not chosen randomly, but selected through generations of watching what happened when different substances were applied to sick and injured bodies. Kaolin clay, smectite, pressed to infected wounds that in a world without antibiotics will spread and kill if not addressed. These clays destroy bacterial cell walls on contact. They draw infection out of tissue. The mechanism was not understood. The outcome was, the wound treated with the right clay closed clean when the untreated wound kept spreading. Modern medicine still uses derivatives of these exact minerals. Kaolpectate. The active ingredient in certain diarrhea treatments today is the same mineral compound a caregiver in this settlement was pressing into a sick body 6,000 years before the pharmaceutical industry existed to name it. The caregiver going down that ladder is not guessing. They are not performing random acts of hope. They are drawing on a pharmacopoeia, unwritten, uncodified, carried in hands and habits and whispered from one generation to the next, that is older than civilization. Older than writing, older than the wheel. The oldest continuously maintained body of medical knowledge in human history, being practiced in this dark room on this sick body with no institutional scaffolding of any kind. Serious illness survived, months of immobility, then recovery, then return to physical labor. That survival required someone going down every time, without exception. In a community where every calorie was already spoken for, where the cost of caring was real and daily and paid by people who were also afraid. It was not heroism. Heroism implies the exceptional person doing the exceptional thing. What the evidence describes is the ordinary, the unremarkable daily act. The person who went down not because they were braver than everyone else, but because in this community, this was simply what you did when someone was sick. It was obligation. Woven so deeply into the fabric of how these people understood themselves and each other that it no longer registered as a choice at all. That is what made it a survival technology. Now look up, at the rooftops. In this settlement, there are no doors at ground level. None. The walls meet the earth in an unbroken line of mud brick. No openings, no passages, no way in or out of any home except through the roof. The ladders go up. The rooftops are the streets. To enter any dwelling, you climb, cross the roof, find the opening, and descend. Every single time. A person too sick to climb stays below automatically. No enforcement needed. No quarantine officer, no locked door, no written rule of any kind. The sickness itself and the height of a ladder do the work. The infected space and the healthy space are separated by something as simple and absolute as gravity. The sick are below, the living move above. The only people who cross between those worlds are the ones who choose to, visibly, deliberately, in full sight of everyone on the rooftop. In a small settlement where everyone knows everyone, the decision to descend into a sick household is a public act. The decision not to descend is equally public. The architecture does not just separate the sick from the healthy, it makes the response to sickness legible. Who showed up? Who didn't? Who has been going down every morning, and who hasn't been seen near that roof opening in days? Every member of the community can see it. Everyone is accountable to it. The settlement was also built with deliberate space between dwelling clusters, not packed wall to wall the way that later, denser urban settlements would be, but grouped, with gaps between groups. Those gaps made accidental contact between household clusters harder. To reach another family's rooftop, you had to cross open space, had to choose to cross. The architecture made intention necessary and accident difficult. Nobody planned this as epidemic management. Nobody sat down with a drawing and said, "These spaces will slow transmission. This roof entry will enforce isolation." The settlement evolved the way all survival knowledge evolves without writing, slowly. Through generations of living and dying and building and watching what happened and building again. The settlements that put their doors at ground level, that built their passages open and their households touching, many of them are simply not in the record the same way. Not because plague destroyed them violently, because the communities that survived long enough to leave a deep record tended to be the ones whose physical structure made collective survival easier. The architecture is a fossil, the fossil of 1,000 lessons about how disease moves, pressed into mud and stone by people long dead, still readable if you know what you are looking at. What looks like a quirk of ancient construction is actually memory. The memory of every settlement that built differently and paid for it, encoded in the height of a doorway and the placement of a ladder. And then there is the grain. Picture the storehouse, a mud brick room, low-ceilinged, smelling of dust and dried seed. Not large by any modern measure, but in a settlement like this one, it is the margin, the difference between surviving winter and not. Every grain inside it was produced by human labor. Every handful represents days of work in a community with no external system to catch them if they fall. What is in that room is what stands between the living and starvation. Now the plague is moving through the village. People are dying. The ones still standing are afraid. They are watching the invisible thing and wondering when it reaches them. And every ancient biological survival instinct they carry is saying the same thing. Secure what you have. Take care of yours. Make sure that when the worst comes, you and the people closest to you have enough. The grain stores don't move that way. They keep flowing, keep being distributed, to the healthy who can work and to the sick who cannot, to the caregivers descending through the rooftops and to the people lying in the dark below. The community that is losing people daily is still, in the middle of that loss, treating its resources as belonging to everyone, including the ones who may not survive to see the next harvest. This is not sentimental. It is not a story about unusually good people. It is a survival calculation that these communities had been running for so long that it no longer felt like a calculation at all. The communities that hoarded, that let fear override the habits of collective life, many of them fractured. Not always from the disease itself, but from what the fracturing did to their capacity to survive it. When caregiving stops, the sick die faster. When the sick die faster, the caregivers lose the people who would have cared for them in turn. When the grain stops moving, the weak go first, and the weak are often the oldest. the people who carry the knowledge of which plants to use and how to prepare them and when. The fracture is self-compounding. It accelerates into something the disease alone would never have produced. What is left in the ground, mostly, is the evidence of the communities that held. 3 things visible from outside. A person going down through a roof with clay and yarrow and water. A settlement built without ground-level doors, with deliberate space between its household clusters. A grain store that kept flowing through the dying. We have seen the skeleton of how they survived, the outer structure. What kept the body of the community alive while the epidemic moved through it. But underneath that skeleton was something else entirely. Something happening in the smoke and the ceremony and the dark interior of that sick room that had nothing to do with the physical body and everything to do with the part of survival that medicine has always struggled to name. The part that lives between the herb and the healing, between the fear and the choice to stay anyway. That is where we go next. We left the village from the outside, the rooftops, the grain store, the person at the ladder making the choice to go down. Now we go inside. The room is dark, not dim, dark. The single opening above is a square of pale sky, unreachable. The floor is packed earth, cool at first, then just cold. The walls press close on every side. Outside, through the mud brick, you can hear the settlement moving. Footsteps on the roof above you, voices, the rhythmic sound of grinding stone, a child somewhere, the ordinary noise of people alive and going about their day. In here, there is only the heat coming off your own body and the knowledge that you cannot stand up. This is what serious illness felt like in a Neolithic settlement, not a hospital. Not a bed with clean linens and a window. A dark room with one way out that you cannot use. The fever moves through you in waves. It peaks in the afternoon and drops at night and peaks again. And after enough cycles, you stop being able to tell the difference between the fever and the room and the particular way time moves when the body is fighting something it cannot see. Days blur. You have watched that square of sky go from black to gray to pale blue and back again more times than you have been able to count. You have lost track of how many times. You have not lost track of the ladder. Every morning, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but always, the ladder creaks. The sound of weight on wood descending. And then the smell arrives before the person does. Sharp, green, bitter at the edges. The smell of something being prepared for you. Something that has been prepared every morning since you went down. Something that your body has learned to associate with the only reliable fact available to it right now. That someone is coming. The first thing the caregiver does when they reach the floor is check the fire. A small hearth in the corner. Not for warmth only, though warmth matters when a feverish body is fighting cold as well as infection, but for what the fire makes possible. They feed it carefully. Not too much, not too little. A fire managed well stays useful. A fire mismanaged becomes a problem. And everything in this room is about managing what can be managed, when so much cannot be. Then they begin to prepare, from a sealed clay vessel, or a cloth bundle, or a woven basket stopped with resin. They remove dried plant material. The yarrow, ground the same way every morning at the same hearth upstairs. But not only yarrow. There is a stone bowl near the hearth that holds a small amount of dried ephedra stems. The caregiver adds these to warm water and watches the color change. Pale green, then deeper. The compounds releasing into the liquid that will open the sick person's airways within minutes of drinking it. Ephedra has been in human hands for at least 15,000 years. Found in burial caves in Morocco dating to that depth, not scattered randomly, but placed deliberately, concentrated. the way you concentrate something you intend to use and intend to keep. The people who placed those ephedra cones in that cave understood what the plant did the same way the caregiver in this room understands it. Not through chemistry, not through any theory, but through the accumulated observation of what happens to a person who breathes it versus a person who doesn't. The chest opens, the breath deepens. The tight, labored respiration of a serious respiratory illness loosens, even briefly, into something that feels like enough. Then the clay, a small piece broken from a larger piece stored near the wall. Specific clay, not the mud brick of the walls, not any clay from any source, but a particular type, sought out and stored separately, the way you store medicine separately from building material. This piece goes into water to soften. When it reaches the right consistency, the caregiver applies it to the wound on the sick person's leg, a cut that happened before the illness, that has been looking darker and more swollen over the past days in a way that means, without intervention, it will spread. The clay goes on warm and pulls slightly as it dries, drawing the infection toward the surface. Modern analysis of these healing clays, kaolin, smectite, the types most commonly found stored near hearths in Neolithic sites, has confirmed what 9,000 years of use already established. They are measurably antibacterial. The mineral composition creates an environment hostile to bacterial cell walls, disrupting the membrane that keeps the bacteria alive. The wound treated with the right clay closes clean. The wound left untreated, or treated with the wrong clay, spreads. The caregiver in this room cannot explain why this works. They know that it works. They have known it their entire life. The way they know that fire is hot and water is cold, not as information, but as the texture of the world. The preparations are done. The caregiver sits. This is also medicine. The sitting. Not because sitting beside a sick person provides any direct pharmacological benefit. Because the sick person, in the dark room, lying alone between visits, exists in a physiological state that the sitting counteracts. Fear does physical things to a body that is trying to heal. It routes resources away from immune function and toward the muscles, the heart rate, the cortisol response, the body preparing to run from something, which is exactly the wrong preparation for the long, slow, inward work of recovery. A person alone in a dark room with no information about what is happening to them, and no certainty that anyone is coming, is a person whose body is spending its limited repair resources on the biological equivalent of screaming. The caregiver sitting on the floor changes that calculation, not because the sick person consciously understands the mechanism, because the nervous system responds to the presence of a known and trusted person the way it responds to safety signals. The heart rate drops slightly. The breath slows slightly. The cortisol that has been elevated for days begins to ease. The body, receiving signals that the immediate crisis is being managed, redirects some of its resources back toward the work of getting well. This is not ancient intuition accidentally aligned with modern science. This is modern science catching up with something ancient practice already knew. Every culture that has ever developed a tradition of caring for the sick has included, as a central element of that care, presence, sitting beside, staying close, not because the healers understood cortisol or the autonomic nervous system, because they watched what happened to people who were cared for in company versus people who were left alone. Watched the ones who had someone sitting beside them survive at higher rates than the ones who didn't. Watched long enough to know, without any theoretical framework to explain it, that the sitting was part of the medicine. But the caregiver is not only sitting, they are making smoke. Not the incidental smoke of the hearth, though that too is doing something. Wood smoke having measurable antimicrobial properties that were observed long before anyone could articulate why. This is deliberate. Specific dried plant material, resins, aromatic herbs, materials that have been selected for what they produce when they burn, placed on the fire with intention. Pine resin, juniper, specific aromatic compounds that volatilize in heat and fill the room with something that reaches the airways, the skin, the nervous system. Fumigation as medicine appears in the earliest written records we have of any medical tradition. Babylonian clay tablets, Egyptian papyri, Chinese texts. Every culture that developed writing developed, almost immediately, written records of fumigation practices that were already old when the writing began. The written traditions are the tail end of something that stretches back through the Neolithic and beyond, back to before there was any way to record it except by doing it. The specific plants varied by region. The principle was consistent. Burn what helps, inhale what heals. Let the smoke do what the hands cannot. What the aromatic compounds in certain smokes do to the nervous system is specific and measurable. They calm. They reduce the acute fear response. They signal to a body under existential stress that the immediate threat is being managed, that something is being done, that the situation is not completely out of control. In a room where everything else is out of control, where the illness has no name and no certain end, the familiar smell of the same preparation made every morning is the most powerful signal of order available. The body receives it as evidence that the world is still organized, still capable of producing care, still here. This is what disaster psychology, many centuries later, would identify as one of the most critical factors in epidemic survival: the preservation of routine, of structured, repeated, familiar activity under conditions of maximum stress. Not because the routine itself saves lives directly, but because it preserves the cognitive and psychological function of the people performing it and the people receiving it. The caregiver who grinds the yarrow and steeps the ephedra and applies the clay and sits and makes the smoke every morning is not only medicating the sick person, they are also medicating themselves, keeping their own capacity to function intact through the act of doing something purposeful and known and connected to yesterday and to tomorrow. The routine is the anchor. For the sick person watching the familiar movements, it is proof that the world is still organized, still moving, still capable of producing tomorrow. For the caregiver performing it, it is proof that there is still something useful to do. In a situation where the fundamental terror is helplessness, where the invisible thing is taking people and nobody can explain why, doing the known thing in the known way is resistance. Not dramatic resistance, not heroic resistance. Quiet, daily, absolutely essential resistance to the psychological collapse that would stop the caregiving and empty the grain store and let the community fracture into isolated units of self-preservation. There was also the shaman, or the healer, or the elder who knew the plants. The specific title varied by culture and community. What did not vary was the role. A designated figure who held, in concentrated form, the medical and cosmological knowledge of the community, and who occupied the boundary between what could be explained and what could not. Picture them entering the sick room, not with the water and the yarrow of the daily caregiver, with something else, with ceremony, with the particular authority of someone whose role is to address not just the body of the sick person, but the fear of the community around them. They perform specific rituals. The content is largely lost to us, but the structure survives in the physical evidence of these sites. The objects arranged with intention, the specific plant materials burned in specific sequences, the movements and words that constitute a formal response to what is happening. They do not know what is causing the illness. They provide a framework for understanding it anyway. They give the dying a name. They give the community a role in responding to it. They make the experience of mass death narratively survivable. This sounds like it is separate from medicine. It is not. A community that can make sense of what is happening to it, even in terms that are cosmologically wrong but psychologically functional, is a community that can keep making decisions, keep showing up, keep descending through the roof openings, keep grinding the yarrow, keep distributing the grain. The shaman's explanation of why people are dying does not have to be scientifically accurate to be effective. It has to be sufficient. It has to give the community enough of a framework to keep acting coherently, to keep the social architecture intact, to keep the systems running that are actually doing the biological work of keeping people alive. The story is not decoration. The story is load-bearing. When the story collapses, when the framework breaks, when the community can no longer make sense of what is happening to it, everything else collapses with it. The caregiving stops because the fear becomes too large to override. The grain store gets hoarded because collective identity dissolves into individual survival calculation. The architecture stops enforcing isolation because the social enforcement that made it work, the visibility, the accountability, the community watching who goes down and who doesn't, requires a community that is still functioning as a community. Take the story away, and you take the foundation from under everything built on it. The Neolithic shaman standing in the dark room performing the ceremony for the sick person and the frightened community was not offering false comfort. They were performing structural maintenance on the social organism that everything else depended on. Outside the dark room, the settlement kept its rhythms. The fires were maintained. The grain was processed. The children were fed and the rooftops were repaired, and the daily work of survival continued alongside the daily work of grief. Not because anyone was indifferent to the dying. The burials beneath the floors, the objects placed beside the dead, the evidence of sustained mourning in these sites, all of it points to communities that felt their losses completely. But they did not stop. They grieved and they kept working. Both things at once, every day, for as long as it took. As the sun goes down, the settlement gathers. Not because anyone has announced it, not because a leader has called the community together, because this is what happens when the sun goes down, has always happened. The fires are moved to the central open space between the dwelling clusters, and people come. The sick stay below. Everyone else comes. The shaman moves through the firelight, carrying ochre-painted stones and carved bone figures and dried bundles of specific plants. Not food, not medicine in the ordinary sense, but the objects that belong to this moment and no other. They chant. They move in the particular way this community has always moved at this particular moment. They speak the names of the people lost that week. They speak the names of the people sick below the rooftops. They make the accounting out loud in front of everyone so that the losses are known and witnessed and held by the whole community rather than carried alone by the families they belong to. Around the fire, people respond, call back, perform the gestures that their tradition assigns to grief acknowledged and grief shared. Some bring small objects, a piece of a dead person's belongings, a carved figure, a handful of grain, and place them at the edge of the fire. An offering or a memorial, or both. The distinction barely mattering because the act is the same either way. This person was here. This person is gone. This community holds them still. The dead beneath the floors of the surrounding homes are part of this. Buried directly below the living space, not outside the settlement, not at a distance, but under the packed earth that the living walk on every day, they are present in a literal and deliberate sense. The ceremony at the fire is not only for the living. It is performed in the presence of everyone the community has ever lost, whose bones are in the ground beneath their feet. The continuity between the dead and the living is not metaphorical. It is architectural. It is the shape of the settlement itself. While the fire still burns and the community is still gathered, this is when the grain is counted and the distribution for the following day is decided. Who needs what? Which households have a caregiver who cannot work because they are spending their days below the rooftops? Which children need extra? The accounting happens here, in public, in front of everyone, so that the distribution is witnessed and the collective decision about who gets what is made by the community rather than by any individual. The ceremony and the logistics are not separate events. They are the same event. The ritual creates the conditions under which the practical decisions can be made fairly, and the people responsible for carrying them out feel accountable to something larger than their own fear. By the time people return to their homes, the fire has settled to coals. The sick are still below. The dead are still in the ground. The invisible thing is still moving through the settlement, and nobody can explain why. But the community has made itself visible to itself, has counted its losses and named them, has decided who gets the grain tomorrow and who descends which ladder and who tends which fire, has reminded itself, in the only way available, by gathering and performing the acts that define it, that it is still a community. That reminder kept people showing up the next morning, which kept the caregiving going, which kept the sick alive long enough to recover, which kept the community from fracturing into the isolated units of individual self-preservation that would have killed it faster than the plague ever could. The ceremony was not separate from the survival system. It was the engine that ran it. Inside the dark room, something is shifting. The fever has broken. Not gone, but lower. The yarrow and the ephedra and the clay and the smoke and the hands that kept repositioning the body through the worst of it have done their accumulated work. The sick person can sit up, cannot climb yet, but can sit, can hold the clay vessel without help, can hear the sounds from above, the footsteps, the voices, the grinding stone, and feel them differently than before. Not as the noise of a world that has moved on without them, as the noise of a world they are going to return to. The caregiver comes down one more time, sees the change, goes back up and tells someone. And gradually, over the days that follow, the sick person begins to climb, first to the bottom of the ladder, then a few rungs, then, one morning, all the way up and through the opening and into the light. The rooftop, the open sky, the smell of fires and grain dust, and the ordinary life of the settlement in every direction. The same place they left weeks or months ago. Changed. New faces missing, new grief in the eyes of the people who stayed, but still here. Still the same rooftops and the same ladders and the same square of sky they watched from the dark below. They made it back. Not because of any single thing, because of the whole system. The yarrow and the ephedra and the clay, the smoke and the shaman and the ceremony, the sitting and the routine, and the grain that kept flowing and the fires that stayed lit, and the person who kept choosing to come down the ladder every morning when every reason said stay above. All of it together. None of it medicine in the way we use that word. All of it medicine in the only sense that has ever mattered. It kept the body alive long enough for the body to heal itself. We have now seen the full inside of how one community survived its plague. The herbs carried down the ladder, the smoke filling the sick room, the shaman holding the community's story together so the community could hold itself together, the ceremonies that kept the living coordinated, the ordinary person who showed up every morning, not out of heroism, but out of the practiced daily habit of not abandoning the people beside them. This was one village, a Neolithic settlement in Turkey, 7,000 years before the Common Era, developing without any formal knowledge of disease, a suite of survival practices that modern medicine keeps rediscovering. One settlement, one epidemic in one place at one time. But the ground is not saying this about one place. It is saying it about dozens of places, hundreds, across continents and centuries and cultures that never spoke to each other. The same herbs near the same kinds of hearths, the same careful burials in the middle of epidemic dying, the same architectural logic of separation, the same evidence of social coherence maintained under maximum pressure. What does it mean that the same survival practices kept appearing independently, everywhere, across the entire span of the ancient world? That question has an answer, and it is larger than any single village. Walk away from this Anatolian settlement and walk east. Keep walking. Cross the forests of what will one day be called Germany. Cross the river systems of the Danube basin. Keep going until the landscape changes, the trees thinning, the soil shifting, the light coming differently off a different kind of ground. Thousands of kilometers from the settlement in Turkey, thousands of kilometers from the grave you just left. Find a hearth. Someone is grinding yarrow. Same plant, same preparation, same concentration of dried material stored near the fire rather than scattered randomly through the dwelling. Same evidence when you look at the bones of the people who lived here, of serious illness survived. The healed lesions, the recovered density, the skeleton that should have died and didn't. Same architectural logic, household clusters spaced apart, gaps between them that made accidental contact harder and deliberate contact a choice. Same careful burials in the middle of epidemic dying. Nobody sent a message. Nobody traveled between these places carrying instructions. There is no trade route connecting the settlement in Turkey to the farming communities of Central Europe that could have carried this knowledge. These people do not know each other exist. They found the same answers because they were asking the same questions. Because epidemic disease asks the same questions of every community it enters, regardless of what language they speak, or what gods they worship, or what their houses are made of. And the answers that kept more people alive than the alternatives kept being found, independently, repeatedly, everywhere, because the answers were always available. They were in the plants growing near every settlement. They were in the logic of space and separation that any community could arrive at, given enough time and enough dying. They were in the human instinct to gather and to care and to hold the grain in common that no culture invented because every culture already had it. This is not the wisdom of one civilization. It is something older than civilization. It is the species, under maximum pressure, doing what it does. Now move east, further in time, a different scale entirely. By 2600 BCE, the cities of the Indus Valley are among the largest concentrations of human beings anywhere on Earth. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, cities of 50,000 people, 100,000 people, numbers that would not be matched in most of the world for another 2,000 years. The density that Çatalhöyük achieved with several thousand people, these cities were achieving at 20 times the scale. The epidemiological pressure was proportionally greater. Something moving through Mohenjo-Daro had more bodies to move through, more transmission opportunities per hour, more potential to accelerate into catastrophe than anything the small farming communities of Anatolia or Europe had ever faced. Walsh the excavated streets of Mohenjo-Daro, and the first thing that strikes you is not the size, it is the order. Not grandeur. These cities were not built for spectacle the way later civilizations would build. No pyramids, no monuments to individual rulers, no single structure dominating everything else and announcing the power of whoever commissioned it. What they built instead was infrastructure. Streets in grids, buildings from standardized bricks, the same dimensions repeated across structures built decades apart, and neighborhoods built by different hands, which means there was city-wide agreement about how things would be built and maintained. Public wells positioned with attention, communal bathing facilities, drainage channels cut into the streets, and beneath the streets, the drains. covered, brick-lined, running in a system so comprehensive that it connected individual households to neighborhood channels to citywide outflows, carrying waste away from the places where people lived and ate and drew their water. Every house in Mohenjo-Daro, not just the wealthy households, not just the central district, every house connected to this system. The scale of collective agreement required to build and maintain this across a city of tens of thousands, across generations of construction and repair, is staggering. Every household had to participate. Every street had to be maintained. Every connection had to be kept clear. This was not a comfort measure. The leading killers in ancient urban environments were waterborne diseases: cholera, typhoid, dysentery, the diseases spread by the proximity of human waste to human food and water. The covered drain was not engineering elegance for its own sake. It was the direct physical separation of the two things whose proximity killed people most reliably. Every covered channel, every brick-lined outflow, every household connection was a reduction in transmission routes for the diseases most likely to kill the city.
The Indus Valley cities, by building their drains, were doing, at civilizational scale, exactly what the roof entry architecture of Çatalhöyük did at village scale, creating physical separation between the dangerous and the safe, without requiring anyone to understand the mechanism by which the separation worked. They did not know about waterborne pathogens. They had no germ theory, no understanding of fecal-oral transmission, no concept of contamination in any scientific sense. What they had was older than science, the accumulated memory of what happened without the drain, of the times the water and the waste occupied the same space, and people died in ways that looked different from other dying, faster, more concentrated, spreading in patterns that followed the water rather than the air. That memory had been pressed over generations into the decision to cover the channel, to line it with brick, to run it away from the living, to connect every household to it, whether they wanted to participate or not, because the system only works if everyone is in it. The drain is a fossil, like the roof entry architecture of Çatalhöyük, like the yarrow stored near the hearth, like the careful burial in the middle of epidemic dying. It is the physical record of knowledge that could not be written down because writing did not yet exist in this form. Pressed into fired clay and laid under the streets of a civilization whose sanitation infrastructure would not be matched anywhere on Earth for 4,000 years. 4,000 years. The Romans would eventually build aqueducts and sewers that the ancient world would marvel at. They arrived at that achievement roughly 4,000 years after the Indus Valley had already done it. The gap is not because the Romans were slow. It is because what the Indus Valley built was extraordinary. A civilization-wide collective agreement about shared infrastructure, maintained across centuries, that expressed in brick and drainage channel the same principle that kept the small communities of Anatolia and Europe alive. Collective survival requires collective stewardship of the things that everyone depends on. But the Indus Valley also gave us something that the drains and the architecture cannot fully capture, something that reveals how knowledge about health and survival was beginning to change, not just accumulating, but transforming into a different kind of thing: the teeth. Excavations at Mehrgarh in what is now Pakistan, predating the great Indus Valley cities, reaching back to roughly 7,000 BCE, produced something nobody expected: drilled teeth. Not crudely drilled, precisely drilled, with bow drills using flint tips, showing the kind of controlled technique that requires training, practice, and the accumulated knowledge of someone who has done this before and been taught by someone who did it before them. The drilling removed decayed tissue. It was not accidental damage. It was a treatment. Someone identifying a pathological condition, acquiring the tools to address it, developing the manual skill to apply them without killing the patient, and passing that skill to someone else.
This is medicine. Recognizable, systematic, practiced medicine. Not the intuitive folk knowledge of herbs and clays, though that was present here too, but the deliberate application of a learned technical skill to a specific problem by someone whose role in the community was defined in part by that knowledge. The person doing the drilling had a specialty. They had been trained. They were, in every sense that matters, a practitioner. What this tells us is that the Indus Valley communities were not only practicing the intuitive, collective survival behaviors of the earlier Neolithic settlements, they were beginning to systematize, to take the accumulated observation of generations, which plant for which illness, which clay for which wound, which preparation for which symptom, and concentrate it in specialists who could maintain it more precisely and transmit it more reliably than general community habit could. This is progress. It is also a new kind of fragility. Knowledge held in specialists can be more precisely maintained than knowledge held everywhere, but it is more vulnerable. When the specialist dies without passing on the knowledge, it is gone. When the specialist's role is disrupted by war or collapse, or the kind of civilizational upheaval that breaks the transmission of formal learning, the knowledge goes with it. The Neolithic communities of Anatolia and Europe survived their epidemics partly because their survival knowledge was distributed, held in every household, in every caregiver, in every person who had ever descended through a roof opening to bring yarrow to a sick neighbor. It was redundant, impossible to destroy with a single blow, because it lived in too many places at once. The move toward specialization was a step forward in sophistication and a step toward a new vulnerability, both at once. The Indus Valley was living on that edge, more capable, more organized, able to apply concentrated knowledge to specific problems in ways that the earlier communities could not, and also more dependent on the survival of the systems and people that carried that concentrated knowledge. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities began to decline. The exact causes are still debated: climate shift, river changes, possibly epidemic disease, possibly all three compounding each other in ways that made each worse. The cities that had endured for centuries began to empty. The drains fell into disrepair. The standardized brick construction gave way to smaller, more improvised building. The population dispersed. What happened to the knowledge? Somewhat with the people, carried in the habits of families who had lived in the great cities and now lived elsewhere, practicing what they had always practiced in new landscapes and smaller communities. Some was lost. The specific technical knowledge of the dental practitioners, the precise engineering of the urban sanitation systems, the concentrated medical traditions of a civilization-scale community. Some of that required the civilization to survive in order to survive itself. But the oldest layer, the practices that predated the cities and would outlast them, persisted. Because it lived where it had always lived. Not in institutions, not in specialists, in the daily acts of ordinary people, in the caregiver's hands, in the herb bundles of the local healer, in the community's instinct to gather and perform the rituals that kept the social fabric intact, in the grain stored and distributed collectively, in the burial performed with attention, even in the middle of dying. That knowledge is older than any civilization. It survived the Indus Valley collapse. It survived everything that came after. One more city, one more epidemic. This one from failure rather than survival, which makes it, in some ways, the most instructive of all. Athens, 430 BCE. The city is already under pressure before the plague arrives. The Peloponnesian War has been grinding for a year. The Athenian strategy has concentrated the rural population inside the city walls. Tens of thousands of people from the surrounding countryside packed into a city straining at its capacity. The sanitation systems are overwhelmed by the density. The social fabric is stretched by war and loss and the particular stress of being besieged. Athens is, by every measure, a great civilization, the birthplace of democracy, of philosophy, of the intellectual traditions that will shape the Western world for 2.5 millennia. It has resources, institutions, formal knowledge, infrastructure. It has more of everything we associate with the capacity to manage crisis than any Neolithic village ever possessed.
And then the plague arrives. The caregivers flee. Not all of them. There are Athenians who descend their equivalent of the latter, who stay beside the sick at real personal cost, and the historian Thucydides records their presence with something that reads like reverence. But enough flee that the system of care collapses in ways it never collapsed in the mud-brick settlements of Anatolia. The public grain reserves, far more sophisticated than anything a Neolithic community possessed, become sites of conflict. The burial rites that had organized Athenian grief for generations are abandoned because there are too many dead and too much fear. Bodies are left in the streets. The temples are full of dying people who crawled inside and could not crawl out. The rituals stop. The ceremonies that had kept Athenian communal identity intact, that had done the same psychological and social work in Athens that they did in every Neolithic settlement that survived its plagues, they stop happening. The social architecture that everything else depended on dissolves under the pressure of a crisis that found the fractures war had already opened, and opened them further. The second-order deaths, people dying not from the disease itself, but from the collapse of the systems that kept them alive, are catastrophic. Thucydides survives. He has the plague and recovers, and does something no one has done before in quite this way. He writes it down, not as a lament, not as a prayer, as a document, clinical, precise, unsentimental in a way that must have cost him something. You can feel the effort of it in the sentences, the determination to look clearly at what most people were looking away from. Symptoms and their sequence, patterns of how it spread. The social collapse described with the same detachment as the physical details, because he understands that they are not separate phenomena. The social collapse was not a response to the epidemic. It was part of it. It was what turned a terrible disease into a civilization-altering catastrophe. He writes it down so that people he will never meet might understand what happened. That document became the founding text of epidemiology. 2,500 years of epidemic medicine begins with a survivor sitting in the wreckage of his city, writing down what he saw. The city failed its plague. The record of the failure survived and taught. Thucydides could not stop what was happening. He could make it legible to the future. That act, the choice to document rather than despair, to turn personal catastrophe into collective knowledge, is the same instinct that drove the unnamed caregiver down the ladder every morning. The instinct to do the useful thing with what you have, even when what you have is very little, even when the outcome is uncertain. What Athens had and lost under pressure was not knowledge. It had more knowledge than any Neolithic village. What it lost was the underlying social architecture, the habits of collective care, the practiced commitment to shared resources, the rituals that kept the community coherent, that made the knowledge actionable. The Neolithic villages had less knowledge and better habits. Athens had better knowledge and habits worn down by war and crowding and political fracture before the plague arrived. When the plague came, what it found in the Neolithic villages was a community still in practice of holding together. What it found in Athens was a community that had already, in the most important sense, begun to come apart. The disease was not the difference. The social architecture was. 3 places, a cluster of farming communities across Neolithic Europe, independently discovering the same survival practices as the settlements of Anatolia and carrying the same evidence in their bones and their burials.
the great cities of the Indus Valley, scaling those practices into civilization-wide infrastructure, building drains from the memory of what happened without them, developing the first recognizable medical specialists from 10,000 years of accumulated caregiving knowledge. Athens, possessing everything and losing it, leaving behind the most detailed record of epidemic failure in the ancient world, written by a man who survived to make the failure useful. The thread connecting all of them is not knowledge. Knowledge varied enormously. The Indus Valley knew things the Neolithic villages didn't. Athens knew things neither of them did. The thread is practice. The daily, unremarkable acts of collective life that function as survival infrastructure precisely because they were never designed as infrastructure. They were just how people lived, how they treated the sick, how they managed the grain, how they gathered and performed the rituals that reminded them they were still a community. In the communities that survived, those practices were so deeply embedded that they held under the maximum pressure epidemic disease applies to human communities. In Athens, under enough of a different kind of pressure, they didn't. We have now traveled from a single dark room in Turkey to the river valleys of Europe, to the great cities of the Indus, to the burning streets of Athens. We have watched the same survival practices appear independently across 3,000 years and 6,000 kilometers. We have watched a civilization that had everything lose the one thing that mattered most. What we have not yet asked is the question that makes all of this personal. What happened to that knowledge? Where did it go when the civilizations that carried it fell? Is it, in any real sense, still here? The answer is yes, and it is stranger and more intimate than anything the ground has told us yet. We asked whether the knowledge survived, whether the practices that kept those ancient communities alive, the yarrow and the clay and the smoke, the roof entry architecture, the grain held in common, the shaman's story, the caregiver's daily descent, whether any of that made it through the collapses and the centuries and the long attrition of time to reach us. The answer is yes, but not in the way you might expect. Not as written wisdom passed down through careful transmission, not as a tradition consciously preserved. The knowledge survived the way the most durable knowledge always survives. Not in books, not in institutions, but in bodies. In the biological inheritance of the people who practiced it long enough for it to change who they were at the cellular level. And in something even older and harder to name than genetics, in the reflexes, in the instincts, in the pull you feel toward another person in crisis that arrives before thought does, before decision does, before you have had any opportunity to choose. That pull is 9,000 years old, at minimum. The woman who was sick in the dark room eventually died. Not from that illness. She recovered from that one, climbed back up through the roof, went back to work, lived whatever years remained to her in the settlement where she had been born. But eventually, like everyone in that settlement, she died. And when she did, they buried her beneath the floor of her home, beneath the packed earth where she had lain sick, where someone had come down the ladder every morning to bring her water and grind the yarrow and hold the clay vessel to her mouth and sit beside her in the smoke-filled dark. The same floor, the same room. She went back into the ground she had almost gone into before, but this time surrounded by the people who had kept her from it. Not fled from, not abandoned at the edge of the settlement, but held close, incorporated into the physical structure of daily life, present in the earth beneath the feet of everyone who would live in that room after her. Her bones are still there. 9,000 years later, in the ground, beneath a site that most people have never heard of, The evidence of her survival is still legible. The healed lesions, the recovered bone density, the skeleton of a person who should have died and didn't, because other people made choices that cost them something real, every day, for as long as it took. She did not know she was evidence of anything. She was just a person who got sick and was cared for and recovered and lived and died and was buried with care by the people who knew her. That is the whole story. Everything else is just us learning to read it. Here is what took the longest to understand. The practices that kept these communities alive, none of them required understanding. Not one. The yarrow ground every morning, the clay pressed to infected wounds, the ephedra that opened airways through the night, the smoke that filled the sick room with something between medicine and memory, the architecture that separated the sick from the healthy without a single written rule, the grain that kept flowing to people who could not contribute to refilling it, the shaman's story that held the community coherent, the caregiver's daily presence that told the sick person's nervous system that the immediate crisis was being managed. None of it required germ theory. None of it required any formal knowledge of how disease moves between bodies. It required only repetition. The daily commitment to doing the same things the community had always done, for reasons no one could fully articulate anymore, because the people who learned why the hard way were long dead. The knowledge was stored in habits, in the shape of how people built and treated the sick and managed what they had in common, in the body, in the reflexes of communities that had been practicing collective survival for so long that it no longer felt like practice. It felt like who they were. And that is exactly why it was so powerful, and exactly why it was so fragile. Habits can be broken. The shape of how people live can change faster than the knowledge encoded in it. A community can lose, in a single generation of war or displacement or political fracture, practices that took 1,000 years of dying to build. Athens did not lose its survival knowledge because it forgot. It lost the conditions that made the practices possible: the social cohesion, the collective identity, the underlying sense that the grain and the sick and the rituals belonged to everyone, before the plague arrived. The knowledge was still there, somewhere, in the individuals who descended the Athenian equivalent of the latter and stayed beside the sick at real personal cost. It was just no longer distributed widely enough to hold the community together. It had become individual virtue rather than collective habit, and individual virtue under maximum pressure is not enough. This is the central irony the whole story has been circling. The communities with the least knowledge survived with the most grace. Not because ignorance is an advantage, because the practices that save communities during epidemic disease are not the product of knowledge. They are the product of habit, of social architecture so deeply embedded in daily life that it functions automatically under the pressure that shuts conscious decision-making down. The moment you have to decide to care for the sick is the moment the system is already under stress. In the communities that survived, the decision had already been made so long ago and so consistently that it no longer registered as a decision at all. It was just what you did. It was just who you were. Now consider what those communities were doing to their own biology without knowing it. This is the part of the story the Neolithic people could not have known, the part that required modern science to make visible. And it is perhaps the strangest and most intimate piece of evidence that the knowledge survived. Because it survived not just in culture, not just in practice, but in the immune systems of the people reading these words right now. Ancient DNA research has revealed something remarkable about what happened to the human immune system during the Neolithic transition.
The early farmers, the people of Çatalhöyük and the river valleys of Europe, and the settlements that would eventually become the Indus Valley cities, were living under epidemic pressure of a kind their hunter-gatherer ancestors had never experienced. Denser populations, closer proximity to domesticated animals, repeated exposure to new pathogens crossing from animal populations into human ones. Their immune systems were being tested, generation after generation, in ways that had no precedent in human evolutionary history. And the immune systems changed. Specifically, they evolved to manage inflammation more precisely. The hyper-alert immune response, the full-force biological reaction that a naive immune system throws at a new pathogen, can kill the person it is trying to protect. The fever that rises too high. The inflammatory response that damages tissue faster than the pathogen does. The cytokine storm that turns a survivable infection into a fatal one. The communities that survived the first agricultural epidemics, across enough generations, were the communities whose immune systems learned to respond with something more calibrated. Not weaker, more sustainable. More capable of the long, slow, managed recovery that the community's social practices were designed to support. Picture it this way. The yarrow was reducing inflammation from outside. The evolving immune system was reducing inflammation from inside. Both moving in the same direction, reinforcing each other, generation after generation. Across thousands of years of coevolution between a set of social practices and the biology of the people who practiced them. The routine that reduced fear was reducing cortisol. The evolving stress response was becoming better calibrated to sustained threat rather than acute crisis, more capable of functioning under the chronic pressure of epidemic mortality rather than shutting down. The caregiving that kept sick bodies alive long enough to recover was selecting, across generations, for the immune profiles best suited to survival. Every element of the system was reinforcing every other element. The community's practices shaped who survived. Who survived shaped the community's biology. The community's biology shaped what practices were most effective. Around and around, for thousands of years, tightening into something that looks from the outside almost like design. It was not design. It was selection. The most patient and ruthless teacher available, the accumulated pressure of epidemic disease across hundreds of generations, teaching a species what survival requires in the only language that evolutionary pressure ever speaks. Who lives and who doesn't, and what their children carry forward. The communities most fully represented in our ancestry, the ones whose lineages reach forward most completely into the present, are the ones that held. The ones that maintained the caregiving and the grain distribution and the ceremonies and the daily practices of collective life under the maximum pressure that epidemic disease applies to human communities. Their biology is our biology. Their immune responses are, in modified and evolved form, our immune responses. Their capacity for collective action under existential stress is still present in us, diluted, complicated, expressed differently across different cultures and different circumstances, but present. We are not merely the cultural inheritors of people who survived. We are their biological continuation. We are the descendants of the people who stayed, not as metaphor, as biological and cultural fact. The humans alive today are the inheritors of individuals who, faced with invisible death and no framework for understanding it, chose, in unremarkable daily acts, without heroism, without theory, without any awareness that what they were doing would matter 9,000 years later, to maintain the systems that kept other people alive. The person who ground the yarrow when they didn't have to. The person who descended through the roof when every instinct said stay above. The person who kept distributing the grain when fear was screaming to hoard it.
The shaman who performed the ceremony when the community needed a story to hold itself together. The unnamed engineer who laid the drain under the street in a city they would never see finished. The man who survived Athens and wrote it all down for people he would never meet. All of them, together, across 9,000 years and every continent and every language the earth has ever spoken. Think about what that lineage means for what you carry right now, today, in your body and in the way you move through the world before you have decided how to move through it. The pull you feel toward a neighbor in crisis. The discomfort of watching someone suffer when you have the capacity to help and choose not to. The instinct to check on someone who hasn't been seen in a few days. The unease of hoarding. The feeling, even when fear is loudest, that securing everything for yourself and leaving nothing for others is somehow a violation of something important. The sense, in the middle of your own fear, that the person who needs care is still worth the cost of caring for. These are not virtues you developed. They are not lessons you learned in school or absorbed from a culture or chose from a menu of possible ways to be. They are behaviors your ancestors survived by for long enough and consistently enough that they became reflexes, became the shape of what you are before you decide what to do, before you know what you are deciding. You did not inherit resilience as an idea. You inherited it as instinct. The yarrow is in your hands. The ladder is in front of you. The choice your ancestors made 10,000 times in dark rooms in Turkey and river valleys in Europe and burning cities in Greece and great cities on the banks of the Indus is still available to you, still encoded in you, still waiting in the body their survival built. The ladder is still there, not literally, but the choice it represented, the decision to move towards someone who needs you at real cost in the middle of your own fear. That choice is still being made every day. In hospitals and homes and communities facing things with no name and no explanation. In the ordinary, unremarkable acts of people who show up not because they are heroes, but because showing up is what they do. Because it is what their people have always done. Because somewhere in the long chain of choices that produced them, someone kept going down. What these early communities understood, in practice if not in theory, in habit if not in knowledge, was something the entire subsequent history of epidemic disease keeps having to relearn. That survival is not a solo act. That the individual immune system, however sophisticated, however evolved by 9,000 years of epidemic pressure, is not the primary unit of epidemic defense. The primary unit is the community. Its coherence, its practices, its daily commitment to the people inside it, its capacity to maintain the systems that keep everyone alive, even when maintaining them costs something real. Medicine advances. We have vaccines and antivirals and intensive care units and public health infrastructure that the Neolithic world could not have imagined. And in every epidemic we have faced, at every level of medical sophistication, the communities that survived best were the ones that also had the thing those ancient villages had: the social architecture, the practiced habits of collective care, the grain held in common, the ceremonies performed, the caregivers who kept descending, the shamans, or their modern equivalents, the public health communicators, the community leaders, the people whose job it is to hold the story together so that everyone else can keep making the right decisions, present and doing their work. The tools change. The principle doesn't. The world does not panic its way through epidemic death. It never has. What carries communities through the dying is not the dramatic gesture or the brilliant intervention or the perfectly designed institutional system. It is the daily practice. The water brought to the person who cannot stand. The yarrow ground at the same hearth every morning. The clay applied to the wound that would otherwise spread. The smoke that fills the sick room with the smell of care. The ceremony that reminds the frightened living they are still a community. The grain distributed to the person who cannot contribute to refilling it. The burial performed with full attention for the person everyone is afraid of. The ordinary human refusal, repeated 10,000 times across 10,000 communities, across 9,000 years of epidemic history, to let the person beside them go without a fight. That refusal is what we are. The proof, the only proof that has ever mattered, is that we are here to say so.